source of the fact that we count so many Ethiopians among the migrants and the refugees that seek dignity somewhere outside that wonderful country that is Ethiopia. I am also very pleased that we could congregate here today. Four representatives, the first is there and is coming in a minute, of the civil society and the democratic opposition of Ethiopia, who are converging on a democratic platform to save the country, because we will hear from them, but my own sense as someone who tries to follow the reality in Ethiopia is that indeed the country is at the brink of great danger, and that would of course spell disaster for all in Africa, because we're talking Ethiopia, we're talking probably the oldest civilization in Africa, one of the oldest in the world. We're talking Ethiopia, 100 million citizens. We're talking Ethiopia, the country that hosts the headquarters of the African Union. And we're talking a country where indeed the totalitarian mismanagement by the ruling powers are fomenting ethnic strife, religious conflict, and of course we see that the bloodshed is growing by the day. But the people of Ethiopia are proud, are not fighting back, and I think understood that indeed the way of the regime to rule was to divide the people, to create conflict, to create hatred among different groups. So we want very much to hear from our friends that gather together here today. I've asked friends from the European Commission, to the European External Action Service, to the missions here, to the African Union to also be here. Of course, the Ethiopian Embassy has also been invited to come, because the objective is indeed to work for a democratic, peaceful transition in Ethiopia, and for indeed for convergence, democratic convergence. Let me just highlight that the last time that I organized here a meeting in this parliament, please, Mr. Solomon, Dr. Bahano Nega was among the guests. Another distinguished guest was Faiza Lileza, this Olympic marathonist who decided to use the marathon in Rio to indeed show the sign of resistance of the Ethiopian people against the repression, the brutal repression of the regime. We have Dr. Merera Gudina, who is the chair of the Oromo Congress, a very respected senior politician in Ethiopia, a major representative of the present and of the future of Ethiopia. And because he dared to come to this meeting, and because he dared to speak frankly about this meeting, and I remember that at that time there was a report that there were about 11,000 prisoners in Ethiopia, and that he said, no, they're not 11,000, they are at least 40,000. Because of that, when he went back to Ethiopia, he was jailed, and he's in jail till this day. And we in the parliament took resolutions to demanding his liberation. The president of the parliament took various initiatives to get his liberation. This was not achieved so far, so I would like here today to pay my respects and again demand the urgent release of Dr. Barrera Godina and all the other prisoners that we know are there, and some of them are emblematic to all the Ethiopians, like Bekele Gerba, like Eskinder Nega, and many, many others, because there are thousands. Without further ado, we are here to hear our Ethiopian friends. We have with us Mr. Yared Ali Mariam, who represents the Coalition of Ethiopian Civil Society. We have Dr. Bahanu Nega, co-chair of the Ethiopian National Movement. I remember, I must say that in 2005, Dr. Bahanu Nega was one of the most important voices that caught the imagination of the people of Ethiopia and made them massively come and participate in these elections. I recall that it was the highest turnout ever seen in Ethiopia. And that there was at least one place where they could not cheat on the results, and this was Addis Ababa. And in Addis Ababa, 23 seats were at stake, 23 seats went to the opposition. And Dr. Bahanu Nega had been appointed by the coalition that he was heading as the mayor of Addis Ababa if the coalition would indeed elect people. And probably the future of Ethiopia would have been very different if indeed the results of those elections had been genuine, and if there had not been the manipulation which we, European Union Election Observation Mission, denounced. I have also with me here Dr. Dima Nogo, the chairman of the Executive Council of the Ethiopian National Movement, and Dr. Solomon Negash, who is a research assistant at the University of Oslo and is from the support group for Tigrayan People's Democratic Movement. I think this is very significant to have a Tigrayan and a representative of the Tigrayan Democratic Movement among us, because as I said, the objective of the current brutal oppression, the oppressive regime, is to indeed fuel conflict, inter-ethnic conflict. And of course, there are many people who lend themselves into a very nasty revenge against the Tigrayan people, because of course we know that the clique that runs Ethiopia and has been at the heart of this totalitarian regime is basically Tigrayan. But it's quite unfair to indeed tag all the Tigrayan people with the actions of the brutal actions of this Tigrayan elite. So I'm particularly happy that among this group that represents the diversity, the ethnic diversity, linguistic religions of Ethiopia, we have as well the Tigrayan. You're very welcome, Mr. Solomon Negash. And so, without further ado, I will start to ask our friend, Mr. Yared Ali Mariam, on behalf of the civil society of Ethiopia coalition, to take the floor.
Thank you, Sana Gomes. On behalf of the Consortium of Ethiopian Civil Society Organization, which is known in Amharic Tibber, I would like to thank Honorable Misana Gomes for giving us this opportunity to speak to Parliament today in this critical time to Ethiopia. And I thank you too for hosting this important meeting to create a platform of democratic convergence for Ethiopia, which we lack at this moment. The Consortium of Ethiopian Civil Society Organization is a newly established coalition of 25 major Ethiopian civil society groups within and outside Ethiopia. We are very worried and concerned on the ongoing political crisis in the country. The situation in Ethiopia has become increasingly unstable since security forces repeatedly fired upon protesters in many parts of the country, mainly in the Oromia and Amhara regions. In this week, just the day after the celebration of the International Human Rights Day, on December 11, 2017, Ethiopian security forces killed more than 15 civilians in Chalenko town in East Hararghe zone of the Oromia regional state, and dozens were also wounded. Since November 2015, security forces have routinely used excessive and unnecessarily lethal force to disperse and suppress the largely peaceful protests in these regions. As a result, nearly 1,000 people have been killed and many others wounded. Numerous human rights activists, journalists, opposition political party leaders, and supporters have been arbitrarily arrested and detained. In this week again, at least 6 university students were killed just because of the ethnic-based tension that has erupted in almost in 12 universities. But I believe that even this ethnic clash in these universities have been orchestrated by the ruling party. For the last 2 years, protesters consistently had taken to the streets throughout the country to express their discontent over the ruling party's dominance in the government affairs, the lack of rule of law, and grave human rights violations for which there has been no accountability in the country. There are no effective avenues to pursue accountability for abuses given the lack of independence of judiciary and legislative constraints. In addition, the deliberate misuse of the anti-terrorism proclamations over broad and vague provisions to target journalists and activists has increased as protests have intensified. Domestic civil society organizations are severely hindered by one of the most restrictive NGO laws in the world. This restrictive and worsening environment underscores the limited avenues available for dialogue and accountability in the country. We, the coalition of Ethiopian civil societies, would like to recommend and urge EU institutions, the European Parliament, the Commission, and the Council to use their diplomatic relation and to play their significant role by pressuring the Ethiopian government to immediately cease the use of excessive and unnecessarily lethal force by security forces against protesters in Oromia, Amhara region, and elsewhere in Ethiopia. To urgently allow access to an international, thorough, independent, impartial, and transparent investigation into all of the deaths resulting from alleged excessive use of force by the security forces and other violations of human rights in the context of the protest, and to ensure that those responsible for human rights violations, the perpetrators, are prosecuted in proceedings which comply with international law and standards. And finally, we urge also the EU to pressure the Ethiopian government to start an inclusive national reconciliation process, including all political parties and civil societies. I thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Yared Alemarian. And without further ado, I'll give the floor to Dr. Panega.
Honorable Chair, ladies and gentlemen, let me first thank you for giving us this opportunity to share our thoughts about the worsening political crisis in Ethiopia and its uncertain but potentially disastrous future. To save time, I will concentrate my remarks on the worsening crisis and its rather dangerous course. My colleague Dr. Dima will talk more about how we as the Ethiopian National Movement envision the way out of this crisis through a well-considered and inclusive transition to a democratic political order, and how the EU can help avert this potential disaster and contribute towards an inclusive political settlement that aims in a meaningful democratic dispensation for the people of Ethiopia. In the last few years, whenever I had the opportunity to address this forum, the most recent one was in November 2016 that Dr. Marara was also with me, and the international community at large, I repeatedly stressed on the importance of dealing with the ever-worsening political impasse in Ethiopia as soon as possible before things get out of hand. I warned repeatedly that the political crisis is slowly but surely moving to a potential armed conflict, or even worse, to an unmanageable civil war with very uncertain consequences. I warned that Ethiopia is deeply unstable and a divided country, and without an urgent and meaningful political settlement that leads to genuine democratization, the country could slip into dangerous instability. I was told at the time by some of the EU experts, particularly those working at DEFCO, that this was an exaggeration on my part, and that according to reliable in-country data they get from the DAC group inside the country and other intelligence sources, despite some noticeable governance-related problems, Ethiopia is a stable, rapidly growing, and well-managed country that serves as a shining example, and in terms of the effectiveness of development cooperation to the rest of the continent. Christine Lagarde, yesterday or before yesterday, repeated this same mantra, which we all know has no basis in the reality of the country. In short, it was an all-out feel-good story that consciously avoids the ugly reality on the ground, partly to avoid the uncomfortable possibility of doing something about it, and potentially antagonize the regime in power. In other words, EU policy seems to be analogous to the proverbial ostrich that buried its head in the sand, wishing the problem to go away. As can be rationally expected, ignoring a problem will not solve it. Instead, it simmers, becomes complicated, and gets harder and very costly to solve as time passes. I believe we have now reached a point in Ethiopia's political crisis whereby neither Ethiopians nor the international community can afford to ignore or wish it away. No self-respecting analyst or expert, however blinded by self-interest to peddle the false Ethiopia rising mantra a year ago, will repeat this blind optimism today. Even the regime's Western supporters seem to be really worried about the country's future and its obvious implications to the region's stability. Neither can the problem be even remotely addressed by the usual divide and rule machinations of the regime, or even by the usual brute force as the government tried as recently as last year when it implemented a failed state of emergency. It is time for anyone interested in the stability of the country and the region to boldly and creatively address the issue with a sense of urgency, as time now is of the essence. In what follows, I will briefly discuss the nature of the crisis currently facing the country to drive home the three critical factors that render the current status quo untenable, and why I believe the current regime is simply incapable of solving the problem on its own. This, I hope, would pave the way for understanding the rationale and practicality of our suggested solution, which would be presented by my colleague, Dr. Dima. Madam Chair, there are three interrelated forces that have coalesced to make the current political situation untenable, requiring a different solution than what has been attempted by the regime and the international community so far. The first is the change in the nature and tenacity of the public resistance against the regime. Last year, when mass protests exploded in the Oromia and Amhara regions, the initial demands raised by the public were predominantly local. The Addis Ababa master plan with regards to Oromia and the Wolkite question in the Amhara region. In the currently ongoing second round public demonstrations, the slogans are decidedly national and invariably call for a regime change. People are simply sick and tired of the current regime's increasingly ineffective divide and rule Byzantine politics, as well as the glaring cronyism and rampant corruption that has permeated the regime's body politic. Corruption and its attendant inflation has made life impossible and desperate for the poor and the rapidly diminishing middle class. Youth unemployment, even for university graduates, is extremely high, generating hopelessness and desperation that is fueling the urge to migrate despite the humongous risk such migration entails as well. Universities in Ethiopia are now hotbeds of dissent against the regime, and no force by the regime is able to stop this almost complete rejection of the regime. I mean, currently almost all the universities are closed because of the protests. And the military is now inside the universities killing and shooting people. The attempt by the regime to play one ethnic group against the other as a desperate attempt to control people's aspirations for change is generating a potentially dangerous backlash against Tigrayans during soccer matches and other social functions, particularly in universities. The recent conflict in Waldia between the soccer fans of the home team along with the local population on the one side and the visiting soccer team and its fans who came from Tigray, as well as the killing of a number of non-Tigrayans in the Adigrat campus and the protests that followed at the universities in Amhara, Oromia, and other regions are only the most recent examples. A sober assessment of the current protests all over the country clearly confirmed the proposition that nothing short of a truly democratic dispensation will be acceptable to the public, and people are willing and ready to sacrifice life and limb to achieve it. Related to this, as demonstrated in recent times, both in the Amhara and Oromia regions, people seem to be willing to defend themselves against the regime's brutality by force of arms if necessary, which is one of the changes that are taking place in these recent protests. The second important and significant development in this second round of protests is the open conflict that we are observing within the ruling coalition, which has left the government in total disarray. The initial conflict took two forms: internal to each member organization, as in the deep conflict within the TPLF, and between the various organizations comprising the EPRDF, for example, between the OPDO and the TPLF and ANDM and that sort of thing. The conflict between the organizations and the regional governments they govern, although brewing behind the public for a while, started to explode publicly with the bloody conflict between the Somali regional government, militia, against the Oromo population living in the borders of the two regions, with participation from the Oromia regional police or militia. This conflict that claimed hundreds of lives in both regions and internally displaced hundreds of thousands of Oromo civilians, as the most recent data that we have is close to 700,000 civilians displaced, has angered the OPDO and the Oromia regional state, partly because OPDO officials believed that the federal army has sided and participated with the Somali Liu force in the killing and displacement of Oromo civilians. This has reawakened a sense of anger and resentment against their obviously subservient role within the ruling coalition, despite the fact that they represent a larger seat in parliament as well as the largest and most populous region in the country. This anger resulted in the observed defiance of OPDO against federal encroachment on regional security matters, including the shooting of civilians during protests in Oromia region by the federal troops. Just 2 days ago, the Oromia region president openly said that the Ethiopian military that has killed all these people in Chalemko was not invited by the regional government. It is illegal. It is against the constitution. I mean, this is the first time that such an open defiance we have started to see between this regional government and the federal government. As well as their ideological turn in favor of Ethiopian unity. I mean, this is another interesting thing. I mean, we start to hear for the first time Oromo leaders, including OPDO leaders, talk about Ethiopian unity and Ethiopian civilization and all these things that they used to more or less reject totally. And nationalism, Ethiopian nationalism, and their close cooperation with ANDM to try to defy TPLF's dominance in the ruling coalition. The Somali region president's defiance against the federal government to somehow manage the region's brutal Liu force, as well as ANDM's internal struggle as the mid to lower cadres openly air their resentment against TPLF's domination, has all combined to literally paralyze the federal government from responding coherently to the country's evolving crisis. To make matters worse, for the ruling party, TPLF's internal conflicts has resulted in the sacking of the chairman and 2 other Politburo members, including Melles's widow, replacing them by Debrecen and Monjorino, or Sable, as they call her. And this internal conflict is itself a reflection of divisions between the army wing led by Samora and the security wing led by Getachew Asefa, which also reflects the internal divisions and distrust among the security apparatus. Without any clear explanation, they fired the chairman and the chairman of TPLF and the 3 other Politburo members without any explanation or a new policy direction to address the country's political crisis. This internal crisis within the ruling coalition has led to a confused and confusing reaction from regional governments and the federal government as the conflict in the country expands and takes ominous ethnic form. The third issue, which makes the situation very, very complicated, is that is fueling the current crisis is the sheer poverty of ideas on the part of the ruling TPLF to come up with a political solution. In its most recent declaration, following the prolonged and acrimonious meeting of the CC of the TPLF that ended with the firing of their chairman, the party essentially reaffirmed its old and failed strategy as a solution for the country's political crisis. After enumerating the various failures of the party, including bad governance and rampant corruption, as well as their inability to control the popular movement challenging their rule, they concluded that this was a problem related to the incompetence of some of the leaders in the organization that they have sacked, and that everything will come back to normal with the new leadership. This so-called new leadership is now hoping to control the situation by using brute force as in the past. There is no new thinking or even a clear understanding on the part of the ruling TPLF as to what is going on in the country and the depths of the resentment that has permeated the whole society, including with some of their former partners as well as within the security establishment against the regime. There isn't even an attempt to mollify the anger of the population by offering some, even minor, reforms, although it is clear that it will not be enough to satisfy the protest movement anymore. In other words, there is no reason to expect that the regime would come up with a solution that could buy it time, let alone to find a more permanent political solution that could stop this sudden and rapid slide to political chaos, with unimaginable consequences to the regime, the people of Ethiopia, and the broader region. Madam Chair, so where and how will all this end? What worries me most when I think of the faltering regime in Ethiopia is that in its do or die fight for its survival, there is nothing the TPLF regime won't do, including immersing Ethiopia into an all-out ethnic civil war. Political developments of the last 1 year have made it very clear that the regime in Ethiopia is neither amenable to reform nor able to stay in power in its current configuration. The ethnic federalism that it has foolishly constructed to divide the population has now exploded in their face, threatening to consume its own creators. All in all, the regime in Ethiopia is at war against its own people, and the recent government instigated ethnic clashes in many parts of the country clearly show that the Ethiopian regime is deliberately pushing the country into a very dangerous downward trajectory of instability and civil strife. If left to TPLF's own devices, it is very difficult to be optimistic about the future of our country. Without an urgent intervention on the part of the international community, along with democratic forces operating inside and outside the country to save the situation, the possibility for the country's situation to deteriorate into an all-out chaos is a real and present danger. But on the other hand, there is some reason to be optimistic about the future of the country with a reasonable political settlement. The Oromo and the Amhara are the 2 largest ethnic groups that make up close to 2/3 of Ethiopia's estimated 100 million population. The EPRDF, TPLF regime has played dirty political games to instill hate and division between these 2 communities. However, the Oromo and the Amhara have stood together, and they both feel they are politically and economically marginalized despite their huge economic resources, large geographic area, and population size. Over the past few years in general, and in the last few months in particular, the Oromos and the Amharas, as well as people from other regions of the country, have been waging the struggle in a semi-coordinated manner, and in their respective leaders inside and outside the country have been expressing solidarity with each other's protests to bring down the brutal minority regime in Ethiopia, which they see as their common foe. Despite the regime's deliberate fomentation of hate and suspicion between the various ethnic communities, the two large ethnic groups and the Ethiopian people at large have stood firm and steadfast to get rid of the brutal minority regime and build their common democratic home together. This is not to undermine the potentially destructive nature of ethnic-based politics in Ethiopia. True, ethnic identity has been the foundation of post-1991 nation building in Ethiopia, largely as a deliberate divide and rule policy of the regime. As a result, in the last 27 years, ethnicity has been the center of official political, social, and economic life in Ethiopia. Ethnic politics is not an accident in Ethiopia. It is strategically planned and executed by the TPLF regime for its political survival. Today, the regime in Ethiopia is inciting ethnic clashes on the one hand, and on the other hand, the same regime is using the failed scare tactic that Ethiopia shall disintegrate in the absence of the EPRDF-TPLF government. But even if we allow ourselves to believe this unfounded claim, the passionate voice of most Ethiopians who vehemently call for the demise of the TPLF regime is not the voice of disintegration. It is the voice of unity and the voice of liberty and equality. The determination of most Ethiopians is to fully democratize Ethiopia and save its unity. The unanimous voice of Ethiopians is no to divide and rule, no to corruption, no to prejudice, no to ethnic cleansing, and most importantly, no to brutality, torture, and extrajudicial killing. The people of Ethiopia carefully and clearly understand that their struggle is against the brutal TPLF regime, not with the people of Tigray, as the regime wants it to be. Even after more than a full year of tremendous upheaval and unspeakable violence perpetrated by the regime, and a peaceful resistance movement that has mobilized millions of people, and despite deliberate provocations by the regime to foment ethnic-based violence, there hasn't been any meaningful attack on civilians of any ethnic group by other civilians. Citizenship-based politics is on the ascendant. Save for the barbarian act of the regime, the people's movement for freedom has been remarkably civilized and unified. This, in my view, is a very good reason for optimism about the future of our country. In other words, the country is at a crossroads. The regime seems intent on driving the country into an abyss. On the other hand, there is a conscious and deliberate move on the part of the people in the protest movement and among the organized opposition to frustrate the ill designs of the regime and avoid a potential chaos. The final outcome is going to be determined by what we in the democratic movement and the international community are able and willing to do in the immediate future to find a soft landing to the country's political crisis. As I have emphasized many times in the past and today, the right way to go forward is simple. It is to answer the demand of the Ethiopian people. And the demand of the Ethiopian people is nothing more than what you Europeans have taken for granted for so many years. It is justice, it is freedom, it is democracy, and it is equality. The only safe path to these fundamental values of humanity is to forge a transitional government that prepares Ethiopia for a transparent, genuinely competitive, free, and fair election. What my colleague Dr. Dima will present today is ANM's vision and roadmap for such a transition. Our organization is committed to such an arrangement and is willing to do whatever it takes to make it work, including opening it up for discussion among the many stakeholders and accept improvements to this roadmap insofar as it leads to the final outcome of creating a genuine democratic dispensation for the country. Madam Chair, for any reasonable person, the choice in Ethiopia is clear. It's a choice between good and evil, justice and injustice, unity and disintegration. Even at this 11th hour, Ethiopians fighting for freedom are still willing to settle this problem peacefully through an all-inclusive dialogue that will lead towards genuine democratization. What the regime must do to ensure this profitable outcome is to wake up and smell the coffee, to understand that the period of tyranny is over. its authoritarian rule is finished, and consequently make the bold and courageous decision to be part of the solution rather than insist on being part and the main creator of the problem. In the absence of that, and with the continuation of the current policy of the regime, more blood is going to be spilled, and as positions get hardened, the conflict gets into a point of no return. At that stage, the only possible way for this conflict to end will be a quick and violent end to this regime, at best, or a seemingly endless civil war at worst. Our preferred choice, the choice of democratic forces in Ethiopia, is clear. The choice of Ethiopian people are justice, unity, equality to prevail in our country, and preferably peaceful. If the alternative given to Ethiopians is between living under a brutalizing tyranny or fight for their dignity and survival even by force, I think the last 1 year has made it abundantly clear where we stand. The ball is now on the regime's and its Western supporters' court. If the aim of Western policy on Ethiopia is to avoid instability and its attendant effects in this crucial region of the world, there is one and only one solution: to democratize Ethiopia. For the international community, this might be just another international crisis in our crisis-ridden world that can somehow be contained. With a country of 100 million people imploding, I'm not sure if its negative effects can be easily contained within the existing boundaries of the country. But more importantly for Ethiopians, this is about living with dignity in their own country and passing a peaceful, democratic, and prosperous country for future generations. Nothing short of genuine democratization can stop these people's march to freedom. I really hope that the EU and its allies will wake up to the bitter reality on the ground and use their tremendous influence to search for a safe landing to this crisis before it is too late. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you so much, Dr. Berhanu-Nega, and thank you for the direct interpellation to the Western world that has indeed been supporting a very brutal totalitarian regime in Ethiopia for decades. That's what I saw in 2005 and today. And thank you for indeed alerting us to the terrible danger that Ethiopia and Africa and all of us are now living with the disintegration indeed becoming a possibility. And I recall that all the time when I was there, and since then we've been saying, I've been hearing the excuse for this blind eye to the tyranny is, oh, the opposition is weak, it's fragmented, they are the only ones who can keep the country together. Well, the country is going down the drain in blood with tremendous consequences, and the opposition is actually showing that they have a clear plan for a democratic future for Ethiopia that passes through elections, inclusive process. And I asked from the EU and from the West, what have they done to help federate and strengthen a democratic opposition? What have they done? They just did nothing and actually entered into the tactics of the regime, of not only through the civil society law to indeed prevent the civil society from fabricating leaders, political leaders, and have only entered this excuse that the opposition is weak to indeed do nothing. We are at indeed a very, very dramatic time, and I hope indeed that the European and American and other leaders indeed find, and the UN institutions do not miss again their responsibilities and choose the democratic, inclusive way which the opposition of Ethiopia expresses here today with this effort for integration, for democratic inclusiveness, because of course that's the only way to save Ethiopia. Thank you, and I will now give the floor to Dr. Dima Nogo, who is with you in the Ethiopian National Movement, and he's the chairman of the Council of the Ethiopian National Movement. Dr. Dima, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak before this body, and I'm honored to be here. Dr. Branu has given a brief description of the current state of affairs in Ethiopia, and I do not want to repeat most of them. Suffice it to say that Ethiopia has indeed been the epitome of human suffering for some time now. It has endured more suffering under decades of tyranny, violence, and mass starvation under successive brutal authoritarian regimes. The current one is probably one of the worst in Ethiopia's long history. That is why the Ethiopian people in general, and the Oromo and Amara peoples in particular during the last 3 years, have been waging a peaceful popular struggle against the regime and for a better future. Despite the brutality of the regime, the loss in hundreds of lives and thousands incarcerated in prisons and concentration camps, the popular struggle has been sustained. Earlier this year, as it is already Dr. Branu mentioned, in a vicious policy of divide and rule and ethnic cleansing, the Ethiopian government unleashed the special commando force known as the Liyu, or Special Police of the Ethiopian Somali region, on innocent Oromo civilians in eastern and southern Ethiopia. This force, whose only parallel in recent history is the Janjaweed militia in Sudan's Darfur region, perfected its brutal tactics against the people of the Ogaden for several years. This force has been recruited, trained, armed, and commanded by the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front-dominated Ethiopian military command. Consequently, nearly 700,000 Oromo civilians have been displaced within their own country, despite being one of the largest humanitarian disasters in recent years. No international humanitarian assistance has reached these people. So we take this opportunity to appeal to the European Union to provide relief assistance to these displaced people. Brutal repression has been the hallmark of the regime, and this has been intensifying during the past few days. As Yared reported, on Monday, 11 December, several people were murdered, including children as young as 10. And scores were wounded when units of the Ethiopian army opened fire on unarmed peaceful protesters in the town of Chalanko in eastern Ethiopia. 20 people were killed, 15 on the spot, and 5 since then from their wounds. The protest was triggered by the assassination of a local notable, Mr. Ahmeddin Ahmed Asasa, earlier by a member of the same Liyu police of the Ethiopian Somali region, who traveled quite a distance from Jijiga to Chalanko to carry out the crime. There are reports of special army units being deployed and carrying out murderous campaigns in and around university campuses in Oromia and Amara regions during the last few days. And people fear the worst. The Ethiopian regime gets a free pass for its crimes from the international community. The deployment of investigators, independent investigators, and human rights monitors has become an urgent matter, and the regime has to be forced to abide by international rules. The Ethiopian people have a long tradition of patience and and tolerance, but there are limits to this. And if the current situation is allowed to continue, it is bound to dwarf what happened in Rwanda in 1994. Ladies and gentlemen, unless urgent measures are taken, the crisis in Ethiopia is bound to affect the entire region, further destabilizing an already crisis-ridden part of Africa, currently holding failed and fragile states and with the largest UN peacekeeping operations anywhere in the world. Ethiopia is at the heart of the Horn of Africa, and with a population of over 100 million. If the crisis continues unchecked, it could lead to millions of people moving across borders, looking for safety, knocking on the doors of Europe itself. If only 10% of the Ethiopian population starts moving, it would involve 10 million people. Addressing the crisis on a timely and sustainable basis is therefore in the interest of all, Europe included. Europe's approach so far, that of bribing authoritarian regimes responsible for the human crisis in their countries, has been counterproductive. European support only emboldens these regimes to free resources for strengthening their repressive measures to stay in power at all costs. Ethiopia needs a lasting and sustainable solution. And let me state briefly the position of my organization, that of the Ethiopian National Movement and the Oromo Democratic Front, which is one of the members of the Ethiopian National Movement. Ethiopia has suffered from a crisis of state legitimacy for decades, unable to install an accountable and legitimate governance that has the support and confidence of the majority of the population. Consequently, it has not been in a position to address the serious domestic and external challenges it faces. The country has been especially in turmoil since the 1974 revolution. The current regime, which came to power in the wake of the collapse of the military regime in 1991, suffered from legitimacy deficit from the beginning due to its sectarian, partisan nature and its many controversial policies. It came to power through a military conquest and maintains it by force of arms. As a result, the popular struggle against the regime, never absent during its entire tenure, intensified during the last 3 years, especially in Oromia and Amhara. The sustained mass uprising has created a serious crisis, including divisions within the regime and instability in the country. Given the situation in which the people have refused to be ruled in the old ways, and the regime is unable to rule as usual or change course, there is an urgent need to address the deteriorating political, security, economic, and humanitarian situation. Addressing these challenges requires a process of dialogue and national accommodation. Madam Chairman, the Ethiopian people have spoken clearly and loudly, but the regime has to be encouraged and pressured, especially by its international partners, to start this process sooner rather than later. The Ethiopian National Movement will do all within its ability to mount internal and external pressures to bring the regime to the negotiating table. If the intransigence of the regime persists, the ENM would employ all non-violent means of popular resistance to bring an end to the authoritarian and divisive regime, so that the country is put on a path of transition towards a sustainable, stable, democratic order. Whichever way the end of the regime is achieved, Ethiopia can no longer afford to repeat the disastrous experiences of past transitions of power. It is the conviction of the ENM that this regime should be the last tyrannical regime in Ethiopia's history. However, the transition from authoritarian rule towards an inclusive, accountable democratic governance requires not only commitment by all parties, but also carefully calculated and crafted steps and measures to effect a smooth transition towards a lasting and sustainable democracy. Democracy is more than the procedural minimums of free and fair elections under conditions of universal suffrage. It has more substantive dimensions, including effective citizenship, popular empowerment, the rule of law, and functioning and robust institutions providing a range of public goods fairly and equitably to all citizens without discrimination. The path would be tortuous, sown with obstacles, but given goodwill and adapting a culture of tolerance and accommodation, the obstacles are not insurmountable. The ENM believes that in order to avoid the pitfalls, three major characteristics of transitions that determine success or failure have to be taken into account. First, we should not only avoid, but also be clear on uncertainty about outcomes, especially the fear of regression. At the same time, we cannot afford the constant flux in how the rules of the political game are defined, and we should be open to utilizing divisions within the ruling elite. Secondly, the core tasks of the immediate post-authoritarian regime are critical, including reforming the armed forces, removing them from politics, establishing procedures for dealing with human rights abuses, and organizing mechanisms for political participation, including channeling pent-up public demands and creating consensus as to the rules regarding how political power is exercised. Thirdly, there is a central role ascribed to the behavior of political elites and competitive elections. On this point, all factions of the elite, including those in the opposition, share enormous responsibilities. We are cognizant of the fact that the outcome of the 1974 revolution and the transition towards a new and better order was thwarted, not just by the military officers who staged a counter-revolution and seized power, but also by the irresponsible actions of the civilian groups that were vying for influence. Hence, the transitional program should be crafted in such a way as to avoid these pitfalls by building a broad enough consensus around core goals. As the popular movement has intensified, we are witnessing divisions within the ruling party coalition. During the past year in particular, reformist elements are emerging from within the ruling coalition. While this should be a welcome development, as it would encourage the regime to be part of the solution, at present the internal struggle is intense and hardline elements are already plotting to eliminate the reformists from their ranks. After a careful evaluation of the current national crisis in our country, the Ethiopian National Movement is putting forward a comprehensive proposal for ending the crisis, and for a credible, smooth transition towards an inclusive political order and sustainable democracy. First, stabilizing the country and building confidence. Any political solution must start with restoring peace and security in the country. This can happen only when the government removes its command posts, military and secret police units, especially from Oromia and Amara, but also other regions where the confrontation is intense, leaving the maintenance of law and order to the local police. The government should unconditionally stop politically motivated imprisonment and killings, harassment of civilians, fostering animosities and pitting communities against one another, and should release all political prisoners, journalists, and civil society activists unconditionally and immediately. Second, convening a national conference. With the people in rebellion and the ruling party itself in disarray and the government discredited, the regime must realize that it is no longer in a position to manage the crisis by itself. It is an extraordinary national crisis that requires an extraordinary national solution. Therefore, it is incumbent upon the current government to agree to convene a national conference of all stakeholders, including political organizations and civic groups inside the country and those forced into exile. The national conference should deliberate on the future governance of the country and interim measures that have to be taken to stabilize the country and usher in a path of freedom and hope. Its major task is to draw up and agree on a transitional program and a roadmap to achieve it. Based on the conditions established by the National Conference, the current parliament and government should be dissolved and a broad-based transitional government of national unity established in its place. Third, immediate tasks of the transitional government. The transitional government shall immediately declare null and void all legislations designed to restrict the basic freedom of people, including freedom of assembly, association, expression, and movement. The transitional government immediately begins a process of national reconciliation and healing. An independent, credible, transparent commission of inquiry shall be established to look into gross violations of human rights, abuse of power, and crimes against humanity with the support of pertinent international bodies. The transitional government shall tackle the humanitarian crisis on a priority basis and also help in the rehabilitation of political prisoners, journalists, civil society activists, internally displaced people, and returning refugees and exiles. The transitional government shall immediately start the process of economic recovery and stabilization by promulgating policies and issuing guidelines to encourage economic activities and rapid economic growth and the creation of employment. Fourth, building the foundations for a democratic state. The transitional government shall immediately commence the process of thorough reforms of the national defense and security forces, the judiciary, the civil service, and electoral bodies to make the institutions competent, professional, non-partisan, and reflective of the country's diverse population. A system of transitional justice shall be established to investigate violations of human rights and other abuses of power. The Commission shall also look into corruption and embezzlement of public and state resources, assets embezzled from the people of Ethiopia and kept in domestic and foreign banks and property holdings will be investigated and returned to their rightful owners. The transitional government shall set up a constitutional commission from broad sections of the population and experts to look into constitutional changes and come up with a document owned and defended by the people of Ethiopia. Moreover, it shall create bodies to deal with all outstanding issues, including the national question, the status of languages, the status of capital city, and the carrying out of a credible census. The vast majority of Ethiopians being rural farmers and land being crucial for their livelihood, the transitional government shall set up a land commission to look into unlawful evictions from land, illegal land deals, and the restoration of land rights. The commission shall also recommend a land tenure system that protects the rights of indigenous people, farmers, pastoralists, and the environment and future generations. Encourages sustainable, equitable development, as well as current needs and future growth. The transitional government shall also overhaul the government-owned media to make them public bodies independent from the government, so that they equitably serve the general interests of society. Fifth, the minimum principles for the transition. No right enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights shall be abridged by the transitional government, and the people shall have the unrestricted freedom to exercise their rights without interference and molestation by the state. The right to assembly, organization, and free expression of opinion shall not be suppressed under any circumstances, and no permission whatsoever shall be required to assemble or organize peaceful protests and to petition the government for redress of grievances. Notifying appropriate authorities for purposes of public safety should be enough. All political organizations have full rights to peacefully organize and campaign for their programs, and the transitional government should encourage the building of a strong civil society and viable, credible political organizations as part of laying a strong foundation for democracy. The transitional government shall safeguard the interests of all the people who live, enter, or reside in the country, including foreigners, residents, and refugees. The transitional government, as much as possible, shall honor all international agreements that Ethiopia has entered into, save for those agreements that violate the country's sovereignty and national interests. It shall foster amicable and friendly relations with all neighboring states and promote inter-African and international cooperation. After completing its tasks as laid down by the National Conference and within the time frame fixed, the transitional government shall organize and hold credible, free, and fair elections and hand over power to the duly elected representatives of the Ethiopian people. Thank you very much. This is our proposal, and we hope all parties, including the government, will know.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dima. We're really, I speak for myself, I'm really impressed in the way the Ethiopian National Movement is figuring out indeed the path for this peaceful transition in unity. And you yourselves, you as you said it, as the chair of also of the Oromo Democratic Front, the largest ethnic group in Ethiopia, are so embedded in this effort to bring about a genuine democratic platform for the transition in Ethiopia, which has to, of course, pass by genuine elections. And your people showed in 2005 the extraordinary commitment to elections. The turnout was massive. I cannot forget that it was supposed to end at 6 o'clock, but by 10 o'clock there were still people queuing to vote, and the National Election Commission had to extend the deadline. It went all peacefully, and the people indeed were ready for that transition. But as you highlighted, it's not just about genuine elections that correspond indeed to the will of the people. There's all the other essential elements for democracy, as you highlighted, basic reforms are needed, and one of them is, of course, the land reform, which was already in 2005 a central question. And it's still even worse now, with a massive land grabbing in which this government has been selling the country out to so-called foreign investors or whoever. And of course it has to do with the basic freedoms of the, namely freedom of the media. I noticed, by the way, and probably this has to do with indeed the deterioration of the situation and the incapacity of control that the current dictatorship is showing, that even the media inside Ethiopia, official media, are becoming bolder and bolder. That is indeed a sign of how the situation is not under control by the regime anymore. And as you also have highlighted, with this very crucial concern of working for national unity and not playing into the game anymore of fueling ethnic conflict, it's essential to stop the attempts to make the people of Tigray in particular pay for the brutal repression of this democratic clique that is mostly formed of Tigrayans. They do not represent the people of Tigray, and that's why we are now going to hear Mr. Solomon Negash, who represents, comes from Oslo, and he represents the Tigrayan People's Democratic Movement, which will have to be part of, indeed, a coalition to save Ethiopia from Tigray to the Ogaden. The people of Ethiopia, the diversity of Ethiopia need to be united against dictatorship and for democracy. So, Dr. Solomon Negash, you have the floor. So, Mr. Solomon Negash. We have it.
Thank you very much, Honorable Chair, ladies and gentlemen. I'm delighted to have this opportunity to present on behalf of support group for Tigrayan political democratic movement. When EPRDF took the power in 1991, I was in elementary school. I have very little knowledge or memory of its predecessor, the military government. People who are younger than me, particularly in Tigray, have probably no memory at all. The Ethiopian population were then estimated around 35 million people, according to the data from World Bank. When EPRDF took power in 1991, the estimate was around 50 million. 26 years later, today, we are well over 100 million people. Between 50 to 65 million people, no other government or any other party that runs the country other than the EPRDF-led autocratic government. We know no one else in our entire life. So one party controlled by very few people from Tigray who are connected more by blood than by political ideals is running the country for more than 26 years, just like a private property. TPLF controls the media and uses it as a propaganda machine to diffuse fabricated histories and lies. It controls the security force and the military and uses them as guardians of its power. It controls the intelligence service and used to spy opponents. It controls the judiciary system and uses it to punish dissidents. It controls the election board and the parliament and uses them as means of legitimizing its cruel power. TPLF controls effectively key state apparatus and secures its power for more than 2 decades. TPLF knows political power cannot be sustained without economic power. Hence, it owns massive portion of the country's economy in the name of Endowment Fund for the Rehabilitation of Tigray, or IFRET, which has nothing to do with the people of Tigray. It controls all the state-owned corporations and industries such as telecommunication, civil aviation, energy, bank, and so on. TPLF secures its power effectively in this way. Today, the Ethiopian people have not a single representation in the parliament. 100% of the seats are controlled by the party. No representation, coupled with absence of media and independent civic institutions, implies that Ethiopian people have no means to express its grievance and cannot be heard. Popular protest seems the only way out, and the people does so unstoppably only for more than 2 years from corner to corner. The way TPLF choose to handle protest is now creating faction among its members and members of the coalition party. In effect, the country is in the year of collapsing. I believe the movements that are based in neighboring country and diaspora today are the hope for Ethiopian people. The diaspora-based satellite televisions are also another important institutions that are creating platform for the people to express their feelings and of course to bring together as well. I believe that these movements and media platform deserve support by all bodies who are concerned about democratic transition in Ethiopia. Madam Chair, allow me now highlight the situation in Tigray, as it seems not clear for most of us, because there is this tendency to blend the people together with a few colleagues in the party. As you know, and you have said, as Dr. Dima has said, in Ethiopia, land is owned by the state, but there is no distinction between the state, the PRF, the TPLF, and the leaders of TPLF. Land is not only used as a political instrument to control the farmer, reward supporters, or buy loyalty, but also as a means of accumulating wealth by the leaders and their networks. In Tigray, where I grew up, more than 80% of the people depends on farming as means of their livelihood, and TPLF is the sole supplier of agricultural inputs, such as fertilizer, input seeds, and veterinary medicines. TPLF determines the prices by setting higher profit margins. Often farmers complain about price and the quality of the inputs they buy, but they often get expired products. Sometimes farmers tend to boycott inputs supplied by TPLF and use instead local products, such as manure, local seed, and so on. But TPLF sets not only the price or the profit margins, but also the quotas. Every year they have to sell a certain metric tons of inputs at a certain margin to secure their predetermined profit. Thus they force and threaten farmers to buy their products. Those who refuse are tagged as Ankafi in Tigrinya, which literally means antagonist, and threatened to be denied from other benefits that are provided by TPLF as a regional government. Most of the time, farmers ended up submitting to TPLF's intimidation and harassment, mainly for fear of, for example, losing participation in safety net programs. Even then, most of the farmers cannot afford to buy on cash and they seek credit. The only credit provider in the region is, once more, TPLF, and the interest rate is determined by TPLF. The rate is unfairly high and the credit must be paid before January. The rationale for setting time to repayment is that farmers may consume their harvest and default on their credit. In order to pay on time, farmers are forced to sell their harvest at lower price when everyone is selling before January or December. Thus, they enter the lean season earlier. Once in lean season, that's when farmers are forced to turn to food aid and safety net to survive. Mercy is in the hands of TPLF. TPLF controls and owns REST, which is the Relief Society of Tigray, which is an organization that gives and denies aid. To get such benefits, peasants must obey. They have to be politically correct. The Human Rights Watch, independent scholars, investigative journalists, and political activists have several times revealed that food aid and safety net has been used as political tool to punish dissidents and reward supporters. When land, agricultural inputs, credit, and food are controlled and manipulated by a single party as a source of profit and means of wielding political power, there is not much left for peasants but to revolt. They TPLF kept the majority of the people effectively under perpetual poverty. Thus, those who cannot bear it anymore are starting to find their own way to deal with it. The Tigrayan People Democratic Movement is one example, which is a movement based in Eritrea and currently working in collaboration with other movements. I hope to strengthen our collaboration. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Solomon Negash. And what you have described about the insidious way in which the people of Tigray are controlled by this clique, totalitarian clique, it's actually what I've heard throughout Ethiopia, not just in Tigray. It's what I heard in 2005. And I remember the first crisis that I had to deal with when I arrived in Ethiopia for the first time in 2005 as head of the EU Election Observation Mission was because the Ethiopian government did not accept the political expert that the European Commission had chosen to be the political expert to the mission. That was actually a Norwegian German citizen, Dr. Siegfried Palzowan. And my first crisis was actually to persuade Dr. Siegfried Palzowan that in order not to compromise the mission, he should accept and go away and not fulfill his contract as the expert mission chosen by the European Union as his electoral process. And I had nothing to do with his selection. This was something that the European Commission had done. And why was he being expelled? Because he had written a leaflet about the land, the way that how controlling the land affecting the country where 85% are peasants and nobody owns the land, and who owns the land it is the state, and the state is the one who provides the fertilizers and then who provides the aid, perversely, the foreign aid that is given to actually as a political tool. He was exposing that in that leaflet. And I remember visiting the African Union at that time. So this is to show how the African Union, as the European Union and everybody else who lives in Ethiopia knows, they pretend they don't know, but they know. I remember visiting at that time the political director of the African Union and wanting to have his assessment about the situation in Ethiopia. And what he did was, he said, well, take this leaflet and read it. All what is there is true. Don't say that I gave it to you. But take this leaflet. And the leaflet was the leaflet about land problems in Ethiopia, written by Dr. Siegfried Palzowan. So what you said, very much what you have experienced, and what the people of Tigray experience is what everybody in Ethiopia is experiencing. Of course, with the aggravation of the last years, but because thanks to people like Mr. Alamoudi, the Saudi Ethiopian person that is now in jail by the Saudi prince in Saudi Arabia, of course, the situation has aggravated, and now it's Malaysians, Indians, Chinese, and Saudis who own or at least who explore the land that is owned by the state, and that has been part of the process to indeed enrich this this totalitarian clique. And I, who have been as a young person a member of the same Marxist, Leninist, Maoist group to which Mr. Durão Barroso belonged, previous president of the European Commission, I can recognize a totalitarian when I see one. I can recognize their ideology, and they were not even shy as showing how the totalitarian Albanian, old Albanian ideology is the ideology that has been enacting in Ethiopia. But it worked for some time. Probably it worked when people were, as you said, 25 million. It doesn't work anymore when they are 100 million, and of course in the current world, globalized world, where people have access, and you have highlighted the importance of the media, and namely of the media of the diaspora of the Ethiopia in the US and Europe and so on. And that media has played a very important role as an alternative of indeed through information to the fake propaganda, to the fake news that the regime of Ethiopia have explored for a long time. It's time to open the floor to any friends who would like to raise any questions to our distinguished guests from the democratic opposition of Ethiopia. The floor is open. Any questions? Any? Yes, please.
Good morning.
Could you say who you are?
Yes, from the Unrepresented Nations and Peoples Organization. I was wondering, I think this is a question for all speakers actually. There is a wide variety of opposition groups in the country. Which ones, in your opinion, are legitimate to participate in building this new Ethiopia? And how do you envision them coming together? In which framework they could discuss the future of the country?
Would any one of you like to reply?
What?
Yes, Dr. Dima.
And then you may.
Yeah, Dr. Dima.
As you know, the political space in Ethiopia is narrow, very much restricted, and whatever opposition is there exists under extremely difficult conditions, but it exists. Most of them, their leaders are in prison. For example, one of the leading opposition parties is the Oromo Federalist Congress, whose leaders have been in prison now for the last 2.5 years, and the chairman was arrested last year. Other opposition also, like the Blue Party leaders are harassed. And there are a few parties also which somehow work in sync with the government. But we don't have any preferences. I mean, we believe all parties who have some credible following in the country should be allowed to participate in the national conference. We should not exclude anyone, be it inside the country or also outside the country. I mean, many of the opposition which is out of the country right now has been forced into exile. Many of us didn't want to be out, but we were forced to leave the country. So we would like to participate to shape the future of our country, and the opposition outside the country should also be allowed to participate. This is, I think, the ground rule must be no exclusions, and all must be free to take part in determining the future of Ethiopia.
Thank you very much.
I think the general principle that Dima has said is true, but at the same time, you have to do, this is a practical stuff, and one of the things that the TPLF has been doing deliberately to give this semblance that it is a multi-party democracy has created something like 50 or 60 different organizations that none of us know even what they are after. Usually one-person, two-person organizations whose purpose is just to be there, to just count as numbers. And the degree to which you can include all of them and make practical headway is very, it's a practical question that you have to deal with it once there is a general understanding and goodwill that we are moving in that direction. And the ultimate verdict about which organization is legitimate and who is not should be left to the people in an election. The issue of what should be the transition should include two principles in my view. One is inclusiveness as much as possible, but also a second, which is important, that is practicality. I mean, if you just put all these forces together, that has no presence, then you cannot really make headway in these kinds of discussions. So I think prudence would dictate that we involve as many groups as possible, but who has some credibility as representative of some group, at least in one form or another, that you can show that it is.
Could I ask, Dr. Bahana, so, but from what you said earlier, I believe that you're even willing to talk to the current regime as part of that inclusive process.
Oh, I mean, if you look at what ENM's transition roadmap, which I'm sure would be presented in its detail very soon to the Ethiopian public. In fact, I think we're using this forum to actually air some of the basic elements, but the full, the detailed.
And I will be happy to disseminate to all the participants.
Yeah, would be presented. Yes, I mean, you don't negotiate among friends only. I mean, you have to negotiate among people who are even your enemies. I mean, that's what negotiation is all about. If we are going to look for, for us, unfortunately, I mean, usually you would expect the government is the one that should be responsible to avoid chaos. I mean, unfortunately, we are facing a situation where the government is the one that is creating the chaos, and the responsibility is stabilizing and creating a soft landing is on us. I mean, we really have to be open, to be magnanimous, to be creative, to think about the country rather than just the individual political organizations. So that's why, in that sense, we want the government itself, the ruling party, at least to be part of this process, rather than create obstacles and create chaos in the country. So we are willing to sit down and talk to the government, to the various opposition. This should be a national dialogue. This should be a dialogue of everyone. So, but the aim, what we insist and that what we made clear is that this transition is to one place. You transition to one place, and that end game has to be very clear. And that end game is establishing a genuine democratic political order in the country. Insofar as everybody agrees that's where we go. This process, with among reasonable people, with the international community support, we can go there. We can always figure out which one is really. I don't think that's a big part of the problem. The big part of the problem that we're facing now is almost all the opposition agrees with this. Opposition that are armed, opposition that are not armed, opposition that are operating inside the country, opposition that everybody says, this is a very critical moment, we have to move there. The only force that is now an obstacle to this is the regime. If the regime can be convinced to sit down and negotiate, the way that Cohen just suggested the other day. I mean, this is the first time that an American former diplomat has openly said this is a very, very dangerous situation. What is bizarre in all this is the EU. I mean, it's really amazing that the European Union, who has the knowledge, we know they have the knowledge, is sitting and watching this happen. It really is bizarre. Then, of course, later, after it's gone apeshit, as the Americans would say, then you start throwing some money at it. I mean, how is it, when do we learn to stop a problem before it explodes? And here is the 11th hour where we can explode it, and the EU can play a significant role because it's one of the big donors to the regime. It cannot even use its muscle to say, enough is enough. This thing cannot go further. If that happens, if there is that consensus, and pressure the government to sit down and talk to the the protesters, to the opposition, to the community, still we might have a way out of this. But it is very difficult to be hopeful given the current international environment, given the paralysis of the EU to do anything about these things, given what is going on in the United States. Sometimes you sit down and you wonder, is there any... but at the end of the day, we believe that it is up to Ethiopians to actually ensure this transition. We need to be responsible, we need to be prudent, we need to look at the interest of the 100 million people in mind rather than temporary political interest by any political organization. And if we do that, I think we have a chance. But it's a very, very small window that we have.
Just to add,
Yes?
yeah, just to add one point regarding this national dialogue. This issue has been raised for the last many years. When there is any crisis in the country, the international community has already raised this issue and tried to pressure the Ethiopian government. But I don't know if you may heard there is an ongoing dialogue within a few opposition parties. I would say the so-called opposition parties, because the main opposition parties are already walked out from this ongoing dialogue. The reason is because in terms of the agenda, in terms of the structure and all arrangements of this dialogue, it is fully influenced and hijacked by the ruling party. But the ruling party officials are publicly saying, well, we are already engaged on this national dialogue and we open the door and invite all opposition parties. But there are selected few issues to discuss with, and they ignored those most important and crucial agendas that opposition parties have raised before the starting of this dialogue. So this agenda is always hijacked by the ruling party. That's what happened in 2005 after Dr. Branu and the rest of opposition leaders were in jail. The ruling party called those pro-government fake parties, and they sit together, and at the end of the day they said, okay, we are now fixed on these things. And I wonder when the international community understand the behavior of this government and misusing and abusing all the opportunities that the government could took and play a significant role for the democratization process in that country. So the international community should understand the nature and the behavior of a kind of government we have.
Please.
Hi, I'm Fernando. I'm also from UNPO. Thank you to the panelists. It's a question to any of you or to all of you. I believe that the Ethiopian regime has been quite successful in marketing the country to the European Union and to the United States and the UK, the main donors, with two main arguments. One, that is the fastest growing economy in Africa and perhaps in the world. And second is that is a country that managed to keep away terrorists. So for those who do not follow the politics of Ethiopia and the human rights violations happening in the country, I wonder until when Ethiopia will get away with the European Union, the US and the UK using these two pillars, these two arguments. What do you think about it?
Maybe, our friends, of course, will say whatever they want, but somehow they have already, Dr. Bahano was clear about his criticisms towards the insensibility of the EU and inaction of the EU. I would like to say that having been here working in the parliament since 2005 and following this relation, I have my own thoughts, and I see that in the US, despite the dysfunctionality of the current Trump administration, people who have always been working in diplomacy or in the academic world, they realize that the situation is extremely dangerous now in Ethiopia. And that's why, as Dr. Bahano has said, people like the former Assistant Secretary of State for Africa, Herman Cohen, have been now very vocal in indeed pushing for this need for a genuine conference of national representation to work for the future of Ethiopia, because of course he is aware, like I am aware, that indeed one of the characteristics of this regime is the capacity to create, it's not just fake news, it's fake parties to pretend they are opposition. But the problem here actually lies with the EU, because I don't see anyone really alerted to the fact that the situation is going down the drain in Ethiopia, and the country is at the brink of disintegration in total bloodshed. And why? I think this has to do with the fact that who has been indeed determining EU policy towards Ethiopia in the last years has been the so-called, what I call the development industry. It's linked to, people like the former EU Commissioner, Mr. Louis Michel, who is actually a member of this parliament, and who had a very strong network of economic interests portrayed as development assistance, and who has established very intense links with, leaders throughout Africa and the developing world, and in particular with corrupt and dictatorships. And obviously the case of Ethiopia dictatorship is one of them. I mean, it was not by chance that late Prime Minister Meles Zenawi, when he had needed treatment for the cancer that killed him, came to Belgium, and it was actually already dead here, and the fabrication was still going on in Ethiopia. I remember I was one of the people who at the time disclosed the information that had got to me that he was dead, when everybody here in Belgium and the elite, the regime in Ethiopia was pretending that he was still alive. That system is staying, is fully in control, despite the changes in the institutions in the EU, despite the creation of the External Action Service that is supposed to give political direction to the ECHO, which is in charge of humanitarian aid, or development assistance, which is in the realm of the Commission. And that's what. That's why the EU representation in Addis Ababa has been so low level and so politically, dominated and catering to the regime. I remember last time that I was in Ethiopia in 2013, the regime could not give me the visa because I was participating in the Joint Parliamentary Assembly of the EU and the ACP countries, which occurred in Addis Ababa, and I remember how difficult it was to persuade the EU delegation in Addis Ababa that we members of this parliament had to have a meeting with the representatives of the genuine opposition in Ethiopia, and not the fake guys that the government would like to fill to see us, but actually the Blue Party people. And we managed to have that meeting, but I can assure you it was after considerable discussion within the EU parliamentarians and imposition to the EU delegation that we would have such a meeting at the EU delegation offices. And they hardly had any contact with the EU delegation. And so this means that we have a serious problem in terms of the capacity of and the willingness of the EU representatives in Ethiopia to actually do what is supposed to be their job and to be properly feeding up with information to Brussels, but also because Brussels doesn't want to hear this news, and because Brussels is captured by these interests. And that is what my own explanation of why the EU has been silent, idle, even when the Americans in a totally dysfunctional administration such as Trump are waking up, because recently Assistant Secretary Yamamoto was dispatched to Ethiopia. And it was not by chance that the Americans are waking up and Europeans are pretending it's business as usual.
Let me add a couple of things, which I think is important for your question. The first is the terrorism angle. which I think is interesting and deliberately ignored on the part of the EU.
Because
you know,
this is what is fueling terrorism.
Yes, as you realize, as you say, I mean, the reason why there is this big support for the Ethiopian regime is supposedly because it is a stabilizing force. I think Obama went and he said, you know, these Ethiopians, they are good at fighting, so we don't have to send our boys there. You know, this is, and it was so naked and so brutal in terms of the honesty. But at the same time, what the international security agencies are now realizing is that the model that supposedly to work in Somalia is not working. I mean, yesterday there was a bomb, some 3-4 weeks ago, if you remember, that bomb killed about 350 people. In fact, in that particular bombing, that was the only bombing that Al-Shabaab did not claim. The only bombing. Because they didn't do it, apparently. In fact, there is a very interesting story that's going on around this whole so-called peacekeepers, that they want the conflict to be fueled because there is this money that is coming from the EU and from the international security apparatus to keep these people there. They don't want this conflict to end. So I mean, there is this sudden realization that we really don't have any meaningful story that would keep terrorism away from that region the way we are doing it now. In fact, there is increasing realization that the whole instability and terrorism is to a certain degree fueled by the Ethiopian regime. And there is quite a lot of research that's going on about the specificities of it. So, but at least on the part of the intelligence community, there is now a sudden realization that this thing is not working. And the reason why it is not working is probably the Ethiopian regime, which has a completely different agenda from it. Now that's the first, so I think there is a realization on the part of the security agencies that this claim that we need to support the Ethiopian regime in order to stop terrorism is actually fake. It's not actually true. It's not actually working. It's actually making it worse. The second, the Groves story, that's the other very interesting thing. I think, Anna, the second part of your statement is more, I think, to the point that I really believe that the EU in Addis sends real report, exactly what's going on in the country. And it dies once it comes to the bureaucracy here because of all the interests that are going on. The development community, as you know, is a really corrupt community. We all know that, and there are all kinds of interests that are going on. They need a feel-good story. You know, here is Ethiopia that is. I mean, Christine Lagarde went to Addis precisely because of the economic crisis that the regime is facing. It does not have foreign currency. The total amount of reserves that it has is now close to 700 million, which is 3 weeks worth imports. I mean, the foreign currency crisis is so serious that the Ethiopian telecom head came to parliament and said, we could not pay our debt in foreign currency because we could not get any foreign currency. I mean, you need to wait at least 6 to 9 months if you are going to get any import permit with foreign exchange. So the economic crisis is real, and Christine Lagarde went to actually say, you know, as you know, the IMF has only one instrument always. It believes in one dogma, and that dogma is, you have a problem, just cut the prices, you know. So
Privatize.
you have a problem, privatize or exchange rate devaluation. I mean, that's what she went and she told them, that you need more money, you need to devalue. And of course, the Ethiopian government devalued by 15% about 3 weeks ago, but that is not solving any of the problems. They are calling for another devaluation, which would lead to the inflation that is actually decimating the population. So this mantra that you can solve economic problems by simply changing prices or exchange rates, which is not working in Europe, as you know, is not working in Ethiopia either. But the point is, they are aware. They know the economic crisis. Ethiopia is now indebted much more than before the debt crisis. You know, I think roughly about $25-30 billion in debt right now to the Chinese, to anyone who is, in fact, they sold bonds in Europe, billions of dollars. They cannot pay any of it. I mean, the amount of payment is close to $2 billion now for interest. And so the economic crisis is real. But how is the IMF and the World Bank and the development community going to say, oh, these things that we were telling you about Africa rising, Ethiopia rising is bull? They can't. They just have to continuously say, oh, everything is good, and let's just put more money. You know, there is a problem. That is where it is. And that's why the crisis is so dangerous in the sense that, you know, you see it coming. It's just like a 250-mile-an-hour train coming at you. You know, you cannot go anywhere. You are just stuck there. And you watch it destroy the whole damn place. I mean, this is literally what the EU is doing, which is very unfortunate.
Could I see a question there, and then we would have a yes. Could you say?
Hi. Well, a question. I'm not sure. So I'm Victoria Gapiegi, and I'm working in the European External Action Service.
Ah, very good. Thank you that you came.
So yes, sorry about that. I mean, my head division intended to come, but then it was a bit of a last-minute thing. So thank you very much for all your interventions. It's been actually very useful, and I fully agree with the assessment that this is I mean the roadmap that you have presented seems very well thought through, and I mean I'm really happy to see a copy of something a bit concrete instead of relying on my really bad notes. So that's first. I mean let me reassure you, as you were saying, Dr. Rana, we do get information, we do get reports, and the delegation is certainly, and there's been now a change in, I think, 80% of the management staff delegation, which meant that there's this sort of a transition period, but we still do get the reports and we get the information that you have shared. I mean, maybe not in that much level of detail, but we are getting this information, and I think we do share several points of the analysis that we're doing. I don't think that we believe in the EU institutions that, okay, everything is fine. In Ethiopia, we are aware that the situation is becoming critical. And this is one of the things that we're regularly discussing with the government and with the authorities, both in Addis and here. I mean, last time that the HRVP visited Addis, I mean, it was a few months ago, it was in March. She did also meet the opposition, and yeah, as you were saying, the proper opposition, not the official opposition. So the discussion is ongoing. I don't think the situation has improved much in that sense. That's my personal assessment. But the dialogue is ongoing. The month, I mean, I think a couple of weeks after her visit, the EU Council for Human Rights, Stavros Lambrinidis, also visited Addis. As you know, he has a specific mandate on human rights. I think he's doing a good job in that sense. So we had a dialogue on human rights, the first and actually only sectoral dialogue that we have launched with Ethiopia so far. And there, I mean, I have just prior to coming here, I had a look at the follow-up of this dialogue, what we're trying to do. We have notably just approved a project to improve the conditions of detention and work notably with the ICRC, focusing on improving the rule of law and human rights standards with law enforcement agencies. So there are some types of activities that you're trying to launch. As you probably also know, the EU Civil Society Fund is the only one which is able to fund civil society organizations in Ethiopia. So, I mean, I understand that we, as EU, we should be doing more, and it's tricky to find ways of doing more and better with the government that we all need to engage with. So it is a difficult task, and any advice on how to convince them to engage better is welcome, and that's a discussion that we can also have separately. But it's difficult to accept that we're seen as the main bad guys in this picture. Difficult to accept because indeed, I mean, we have made several statements in the past couple of years on this. Maybe not as strong as they could have been, but we have made several statements on the situation. We have expressed some concerns repeatedly with the authorities, also privately. So there is work ongoing. Whether it's sufficient, well, given the situation, probably not. But I think we are trying to get there, and the whole international community, the EU, but also, and very importantly, member states are also getting this idea, and this urgency is getting trickier. But as you know, the EU sometimes moves very slowly, because the EU is not just the EU, it's not just the External Action Service, as you say, it's also the development community, it's also all the member states. The EU is one of the biggest donors in Ethiopia, but it's not the biggest donor, especially now if we have one member state who's leaving and who is the main donor in the country. So it's also a matter of working together with the rest of the international community. But as I said, we are trying to have some activities in Ethiopia related to human rights, trying to work with other international partners. But yes, it is a difficult path ahead, and thank you for this. We are, one of the main messages that we're passing now is exactly that one, that the current dialogue is not sufficient. You need, the ruling party needs to open up to all stakeholders in a genuine and inclusive dialogue with all stakeholders inside and outside Ethiopia. And this is a discussion, this is something that we're pushing for. But as you know, the Ethiopian government doesn't necessarily react well if you become too threatening. So that's...
But yeah, thank you so much for the points you've made, and for being here. Indeed, what I can tell you is that I sense that the EU has tremendous influence in Ethiopia, could use it much more than it does. And it's not just about the aid. Actually, the aid is in a way, a perverse tool, which has actually explained many inaction. As the Chinese say, every crisis is an opportunity, and even the Brexit with this partner, European partner that is leaving, which has dominated as well the policy towards Ethiopia, especially from this perverse angle, could be an opportunity. Definitely the EU is very much a reference to all Ethiopians, and that's why it's a positive reference, and that's why there is so much disappointment with the lack of a more proactive role with the EU. It's not just about putting out beautiful statements or sending representatives that say all the right things. It's actually pressing, not being afraid of, indeed, a very aggressive stance on the part of the government, and pushing them to really engage with a real opposition, because this is now, we are on the brink of a disaster, and this is now absolutely essential to save the country. So what the EU can do now in indeed pressing for this, a genuine inclusive dialogue, can be determinant, can be absolutely determinant. Definitely Ethiopians look for us, look for the Union, and the Union has tremendous influence that it has absolutely wasted in Ethiopia, being captured as it has been by these different interests, and namely, be it British strategy, be it economic interests that hide under the so-called development industry. Dr. Yareb, and I have another question here and another question. So let's go for the questions, since we have now 20 minutes. So the questions now, and then the speakers make final remarks. Yes.
Thank you.
Yes.
Madam. Thank you for all the speakers. All have described. Well, I am Gabayao, Deutsche Welle Africa Service. So, thank you. All the problems in Ethiopia were described, and I think there is an agreement on the scale of the problems. And the proposals that Dr. Dima has proposed was also a roadmap that could give a hint as a solution. But my question is, how much this all agreed and all call for transitional government, all oppositions, how much these proposals, at least there is agreement on the scale of the problem, but on the proposals and coming together, how much agreement is there among the oppositions, at least in the diaspora? Because it's said that the people at home are more united than the oppositions in diaspora. So I just want to know the progress made among the opposition groups. And another question to Madam Gomes, it's about Marara. I was here as a journalist and I have talked to him, and it's a pity that he was in jail when he came back. And the European Parliament have passed a resolution and pushed, of course, for the case. But since then, he's almost forgotten. Can European Union continue being silent after, just for such a situation when an opposition leader who was invited and talked to the European officials and but jailed when he turns back? I mean, with all other things, is the minimum thing. Couldn't, I mean, after the European Parliament have passed a resolution, could there not be a concrete measure, or can we expect some more things are happening about his case? Because it's a pity that he has been here with talking with European officials, but it's clear he was jailed when he came back. I mean, there is no guarantee in that case for a person who just came here for a work visit, and then if he's in jail when he came back, then what's the guarantee? And is there something concrete that's going on regarding Mr. Marara? Thank you.
Yeah, just a short question to Mrs. Ana Gomes. You identified Louis Michel as, one of the heads of the pro-Addis lobby in Brussels. I can just say that it's beyond that. There is a certain formality, because I understand he's a chair of
the Joint Parliament
of a friendship association between the European Union and Ethiopia. But since I'm a journalist working for, namely BBC Update, also the Tageszeitung, etc., I'm curious. I'd like to know whom you do identify as the other heads of the Addis lobby here in Brussels, either business, politics, whatever. I mean, that would help us to have a thicker file.
Well, I will, of course, then yield the floor to my distinguished Ethiopian guests. I'll just answer briefly these two questions. Yes, Dr. Marara Gudina has been a big concern for us, and for me in particular. I invited him to be here. I believe that I've been putting pressure after the Parliament adopted the resolution. There were also the marches by our President of the Parliament regarding Dr. Marara. I know that this was one of the topics when Federica Mogherini, the High Representative, visited Ethiopia. I know that when Stavros Lambrinidis came to Ethiopia in this framework of this human rights dialogue, this was one of the cases prominent. But here we are, exactly in front of a situation where, despite the EU doing nice démarches, I mean, the Parliament did what is, of course, the ultimate tool of the Parliament, the political tool of a resolution, a full resolution. And then, but despite all these other démarches, we are there faced with a wall of a regime that is used to not consider the EU, because they know they can soften the mood of the EU. That's what they have achieved all these years in face of even graver situations, massacres, and so on. I remember, and it's not the first case, I remember when Birtukan Medeksa, after she came to this Parliament, then she came from prison, where she was with Dr. Barano Nega, Dr. Barana was arrested after the elections in 2005. We campaigned for the liberation of all those who were arrested, like with Dr. Barana after the campaign in 2005. They got out in 2007 when it was the Ethiopian millennium because of the joint endeavors of us in the European Parliament and the US Congress to liberate them. Birtukan was one of the people liberated. She came to this parliament in 2009 to plead with us that despite all what had happened, that we would go back to observe the elections in 2010. Because the EU election observation would allow some level playing field, some debate, it was necessary. That's what she came to plead with us. And I remember my dear friend Glenys Kinnock was at that meeting. And then she went to Sweden, and some discussion there. When she went back to Ethiopia, she was arrested. We spent 2 years campaigning for Birtukan's release. That was done. We spent a lot of energy for the release of Rayot Alemo. In 2013, when we went to Addis in the framework of this Joint Parliamentary Assembly, ACP, European Union, we knew that Rayot Alemo was undergoing cancer. There were several members, I remember Olle Schmidt, a Swedish member, campaigning for Rayot to be released. We campaigned, we had a law, me and my colleague Michel Rivasi from the Greens, a lot of pressure on Mr. Louis Michel, who was and still is co-chair of the ACP Joint Parliamentary Assembly, to go with his co-chair to the prison of Kaliti to visit Rayot Alemo and Eskide Nega and other political prisoners. He went to Kaliti because of our pressure. He didn't speak with any of the prisoners, and he even came back and told us that things were fine. They had a courtyard, and they even had an internet room. I pointed out at that point, fantastic. They, the terrorists, as they are called in the prison of Kaliti, have an internet room, and we, parliamentarians here at the Hilton Hotel, don't have internet in the hotel. Only at the African Union who have internet, because nobody else had internet in there, because of course this was a way to control the communication. So I think this, in a way, answers as well your question. I'm not shy about identifying Mr. Louis Michel as indeed the head of a system that has used development policy for economic or other political interests. They, of course, crafted it in strategic terms. The disintegration of Ethiopia must be avoided, so therefore this clique controls. But this is what we are coming to the point where the clique doesn't control anymore. Mm-hmm. And Ethiopia is at the brink of disintegration. And I cannot tell you other friends. What I can tell you is that I know, Dr. Merara Gudina was arrested at the end of November. He came here on the 9th of November, I believe, and he was arrested at the end of November. And then, if you look, the resolution of the European Parliament was only adopted 5 or 6 months later. Why? Because there was a lobby inside the Parliament lobbying against that resolution. And that lobby was added by Mr. Louis Michel and the so-called Ethiopian Friendship Association. That's why it took 6 months of campaigning for an obvious thing that this Parliament had to do. This is how perverse the situation is, and that's why I'm not shy at identifying Mr. Louis Michel. There will be other people, namely all the other people who have worked with him and who are now in top positions in different services within the Commission and within the External Action Service, and who actually are the people who are receiving all these reports from the ground, but who simply do not act or keep this pretense that we have to pretend we don't see, because they keep Ethiopia united and they keep us in business. The floor is from Mr. Yare.
Okay, thank you. Just to add 2 things. One, my colleague raised a question about the the relationship between the international community and the Ethiopian region that has focused on this development, growth, and terrorism. And as Dr. Brahanu well said, I'm not going to take those issues, but there is now another element. Starting from, I think it was 2 years back, Ethiopia is the second or the third, from 2 or 3 countries, it's one of the countries who signed an agreement with the European Union to keep refugees in their country. So the refugee crisis is another element of engaging the international community with Ethiopia. And it's really disappointing as an Ethiopian, as a human rights activist. It is really frustrating because as if all refugees are fleeing from their country just because of economic crisis, they are pumping in millions of euro to this brutal and dictatorial region to keep those repressive peoples in their own land.
Yes.
This is really to show how the international community is getting, from time to time, the international politica is getting ridiculous. Really, it's very, just after the sign of this agreement, the German Chancellor Angela Merkel, she visited Ethiopia and she strengthened this issue, and I think the business is now on table and they are playing with this another card, okay? And the other thing that I want to thank my friend, I always visit her in her office, but as usual, I want to say the international community has 2 things: the stick and the carrot is on their hand. So in some countries, when they want, they have a long hand and they throw away the brutal regimes. Even in some countries, they intervene without having concrete evidences that human rights violations, as much as what's happening in Ethiopia. But in the case of Ethiopia, because the international community is dealing on these issues, they have they play with this double standard. So when EU play with, I'm not saying that sanctions on humanitarian aid and so on, but we know that this regime is fully supported and survived by these funds from all corners of the international community. So at least minimizing the size of the carrot, or maybe still there are rooms and there are opportunities to the international community to make strong pressure to the Ethiopian government, at least to respect human rights, to stop killing. When we are talking today, at this moment, students are dying. And you are still saying that, oh, we are still busy with this government on dialogue and diplomatic relationship, and it's not really enough. And the Ethiopian people, I don't think, waiting when the international community use its stick, because people are already on the streets. So at the end of the day, not only Ethiopians or the ruling party, but even the international community will lose from all of its interests once this country sink to really unpredictable situation. So I strongly, on behalf of the consortium of 25 Ethiopian civil society that I'm representing now, we are strongly urge the international community to act before it's late. Thank you.
Let me just say a couple of things. I forgot your name from the Victoria? From the external action committee. Action service. Let me preface by saying, I mean, when you sit down and think about the hypocrisy, it really is mind-boggling. I mean, if you look at the total number of people killed in Zimbabwe under Mugabe, since Mugabe took power, and the number of people killed in Ethiopia in the last 1 month. 1 month. More people are killed in Ethiopia during this past 1 month than all the people that Mugabe supposedly killed for political purpose. And you know how the British and the others get excited when it comes to Mugabe, right? I mean, when it comes to Ethiopia, of course, who cares, right? I mean, so the question of who cares, I think Victoria said a little bit about the big donor being the UK, now that they are leaving. By the way, I'm not sure whether I should congratulate Europe for this or not. This argument that the Ethiopian government does not respond well to external threat, especially external threat that cuts aid, is absolutely foolish. That's just simply not true. In fact, the Ethiopian government, the current Ethiopian government, has no fear other than the amount of money that it is getting from Europe being cut, more than anywhere else. I mean, this is so obvious. I mean, you don't need to be a genius to figure this out. Here is a government that's totally trapped by the foreign exchange shortage, mainly because they have been skimming money out of that country to the tune of $3 billion a year. $3 billion a year goes out of Ethiopia in the form of illegal flows, financial flows out of the country. Roughly about 3 billion. I mean, if you look at the data from the financial integrity site, it is just unbelievable. So there is no money. They have between 25 billion and 30 billion dollars in foreign debt, which they cannot pay. And the Chinese are not like the Europeans who give money for free. And a good part of this debt has been Chinese denominated, and they have to pay. The government is in total financial crisis. This is a time for Europe to say, you are not going to get money while we watch the country going down the drain. I mean, just that, you'd see, would have more impact. I mean, initially they would protest and they say, oh, like Mallas used to say, you can take your money and shove it if you want. And it was buffoonery at the past, empty threats. It would be even more so now. If Europe really is committed to have a smooth transition, the weapon that it has is this money, and it should say, no, we are not going to pay for a regime that is leading a country of 100 million into a crisis, into a complete disaster. That by itself would have significant impact in changing the government's mind. The second, I mean, I sometimes have such difficulty to understand how Europe thinks about problems. So you have a lot of refugees coming from these different countries, mostly because they are not comfortable about their countries, either because of political persecution or because the economies are not working in such a way that they would give them basic needs. So how does Europe respond to this? It gives money to the governments who are actually creating these refugees, so that what? So that they would stop the refugees. Obviously, the more you send, the more money you get. I mean, why the hell would you do that? I mean, it's just bizarre. It really is bizarre the way the perversion of this thing works. It's not even not the humanitarian aspect. The idea that you can stop refugees from flowing from Africa to Europe because you give money to these governments, who, more than 50, 70, 80% of it would be skimmed in any case. I don't know what books they are reading when you come up with these kinds of solutions. Honestly, I mean, it just doesn't make any sense. But what I really want to say is, trust me, and for a change, trust us. Stop the money flow, even threaten that the money is not going to happen. You'll start to see the European government bend. Rather, I mean, they would, of course, huff and puff and scream about European colonialism